Fantastic. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Long drive?
No, I like this. It was very local for me. I actually grew up around here, so it's a little nostalgic.
Yeah. What did your dad do in the area? Were you in Palo Alto, or were you Mountain View, or where were you?
Oh well, no, it's a little bit like military family. Moved around a lot as a child, so Menlo Park, Mountain View, Los Altos Hills, like all over the place,
Wow.
really.
Very
But no, my
very
parents are both
disruptive.
my parents are both doctors, and so actually I grew up almost completely ignorant of the technology industry. No one in my family had ever been an engineer, wasn't part of the startup community. So actually, in retrospect, I went to school and was around a lot of people who worked in the industry, but I actually didn't realize that really until I went to college. I went to Stanford, so really far. Got to move away from home.
It's tough.
Yeah, exactly. But no, it's interesting, and I actually get some value. It's funny being at Wealthfront. One of the hottest areas in finance the last 10, 15 years has been behavioral finance, which is rests deep on psychology. And so I think I made my mom proud. She's been a clinical psychologist for 40 years, and she's like, yes. He's like, it's good. So.
Tell us about you started NASA. What were you doing as an intern at what does an intern do at NASA?
All right. Well, so my senior year in high school, there was a program where you could spend, instead of going to high school senior year, which seems like a good time, you could spend one day a week as an intern at NASA. So NASA Ames, which is actually now somehow morphing into the Google campus. This is back when it was also Moffett Field, like big Air Force base, before all that closed down. And so that actually turned out to be the place with the giant wind tunnels, where they were first. That's where they would test out all the new aircraft and new designs and even some space designs. And that also turned out to be one of the hubs for doing computational fluid dynamics to figure out airflow. And so it seemed appropriate that in high school that they were trying to write software to see how close the theoretical models could come to the actual wind tunnels. And so I basically burned a lot of expensive supercomputer time basically trying to project theoretically how a sphere would move through a liquid and see how that compared to actually the wind tunnel experiments, and if you could parallelize that over, 64,000 processors.
I
That
worked
was hot in 90, 91.
Well, and I worked at McDonald's in high school, so I had a similar experience. The hash browns
That's right.
and how quickly they would fly when you threw them at someone else. Um, you also worked at Next, is that right? I know it says Apple, but were you like there at the very end when they got bought, or how did that work?
Yeah, it's a tricky story. I interviewed at Next.
Okay.
So the original manager who hired me, Craig Federighi, actually now runs software at Apple, and he had built this team at Next focused on web objects. So if you look at even iTunes today, you see those URLs .woa, and that doesn't make any sense. It's a web objects application. That's the code base going back to Next days. I feel like there's like millions of iOS programmers now wondering why all these libraries are called NS, string, all that stuff. It's Next Step. So I interviewed at Next and got an offer there. But then in December, they said, well, we have to put a hold on this. And it turned out they got bought by Apple December '96. And so I did get the offer, but I actually started at Apple. So I was at Apple, my original job. So I actually worked in the original Next headquarters in Redwood Shores before we moved to Infinite Loop. But technically, I was always at Apple. I was just in that weird building in Infinite Loop. We took over where Newton used to be. And I was writing Java code because, of course, everyone knew that Objective-C was going away. And so my first job was porting the interface layer over from Objective-C to this new interface library called Swing, which was big in the early Java days.
Did you have any experiences with Steve Jobs? Did you meet him?
Yeah, well, I was young. I was 22.
Yeah.
But actually, I have a few moments. It was hard. Steve was actually very close to the Next folks. The Next family was really a family, I think, to him that was kind of in his years in the wilderness, right, built up around, and I think that carried over to when he came back to Apple. There's a few Steve moments. It's probably can't share them all. When he passed away, I did write about one of them in a blog post, because you have to understand that when I went to Apple, Pretty much that was like an IQ test that you were failing, right? Like every publication said that Apple was going away. I actually had a bet with a friend of mine. He bet me $5,000 that Apple would be out of business within 5 years. And so you had to really want to do something to go to Apple at that time. But there were amazing people. And I remember when Steve took over, he called together this meeting of the entire OS group. It was called Rhapsody at the time. It was a code name. It's what became Mac OS 10, right, which we have today. And he basically threw up this giant picture of Michael Dell on the wall. And so if you don't, so in the 90s, people cared a lot about what Michael Dell said. And because Dell was like the hottest company, right? Like it's a little hard to map over, but it was like the hottest company. And so they said, like, what would you do with Apple if you ran Apple? And Dell, of course, said, well, I think that some problems can't be solved. I'd return the cash to shareholders, which is a really dark thing to say. And so Steve put Michael Dell up on the wall, and he said to the whole team, he said, look, Michael Dell thinks that we literally add no value, that we should, we should just head home and return cash to shareholders. And he said, you know what? If we keep doing what we're doing, he's right. Because the world doesn't need another Compaq. It doesn't need another Dell. Those companies do a great job of building boring beige PCs for everyone. The world doesn't need another company like that. He said, how much market share does BMW have? He's like, it's 1.5%. But no one knows that and no one cares. Because you're either looking at one that you want to buy or you're watching one that's driving by. Like BMW lives to make cars that people don't just want, that they lust after. And Apple could be the company that makes computers and devices that people don't just use, but that they lust after. He was very big on this word. And I just thought that was an amazing moment, because the truth was, he said Apple was a startup. It may have $6 billion, right, but it was still a startup. It was going to be long hours. He was going to give everyone more stock. But there were a lot easier ways to make money out there. And if you wanted one, it was fine to go. But if you wanted to be a part of this, you could. And it was very meaningful. And so I reflect on the fact that when I was at eBay a decade later, eBay went through its own difficulty in 2005, 2006, trying to figure out what it was. And it didn't have that same earnestness. Actually, eBay took a very pragmatic approach. And I reflect on the fact that, like, Steve had that ability to kind of say, look, it's not that he didn't have anything to prove. It was almost like it wasn't worth fighting any other way. And so I reflect on that a little bit. At eBay, it helped me in terms of making decisions about what to build there. I thought about it at LinkedIn. At Wealthfront, I've written posts about the fact that I think that entrepreneurs need to have purpose. If you're just building another company that's like 12 other companies that came before you, I think about those words. It's, does the world really need another X? Hopefully you're trying to build something different.
That message coming from Steve Jobs, do you feel like that message can be delivered by just a great leader, or does that need to come from a founder or somebody that was there right at the beginning? Like, could eBay have done it with a better CEO, or did they need?
I think actually Meg was a great CEO. You have to remember, Meg joined eBay when it was like 30 people.
Sure.
And built that out. Look, right now in Silicon Valley, the idea of a non-founder CEO has become a little bit of like this strange, like I've heard a tale that there might be a non-founder CEO somewhere. And of course I'm biased because I'm a non-founder CEO. But I look at what Jeff Weiner's done at LinkedIn with Reed, and it's phenomenal. I think that in technology, we're a little bit immature about this idea that the only way to gain moral authority is to be a founder. And yet we know historically, whether it's the military, whether it's companies that are built to last, whether it's other large organizations, that moral authority doesn't have to come from the fact that you started the group. I just think that that's a shortcut to having moral authority. And so I do think in technology we're a little immature because we always lean on that. But the truth is, it's really about having moral authority. It's really about having a purpose, having enough charisma so that people believe in that purpose and will follow and execute. And it has to be something that's meaningful to the people that you're talking to. So, Steve never said in that entire talk, I know it's Steve Jobs, he's famous and blah, blah. And by the way, he was a scary guy sometimes. But
Seemed like you have an experience or two, maybe.
no. He was. Actually, the scariest thing that ever happened to me with Steve Jobs was something that didn't happen at all, because I basically went up to him in the cafeteria after a Pixar shareholders meeting, and I had gone to it because I owned shares in Pixar. It was like one of the first stocks I owned. And I told him I thought it was amazing. I was kind of gushing. I was like, I really like this, and I really like that, and all this other stuff. I'm giving all these opinions about Pixar. I'm like a 22-year-old engineer, like 3 weeks into Apple. And I'm sure he was like entertaining someone massively important in the cafeteria. And he was actually amazingly gracious. He just looked at me and said, thank you. I think Pixar is going to be an amazing company. We're trying to do something important. So anyway, but I was actually scared he was going to but the
Please
point
have
is
him
like
removed.
he never actually said during any of the talk that I saw there, hey, look, I founded this company for a reason, right? Like I didn't start Apple to end up like in this place. Like there was none of that. There was none of that ego. There was none of the like, hey, I bet my career or my reputation on turning this thing around, and I've seen all those different patterns, but he had none of those. He literally just put up there and said, look, this is important, this is interesting, this is worth doing, this is different. And he was totally happy with the fact that if you didn't agree, like, see you later. No regrets.
You joined LinkedIn at a really interesting time because it was started in 2003, 2004, and then you come in this kind of 2007, 2008 period where it was sort of in this no man's land of it was gaining users. Everyone seemed to be getting LinkedIn emails and signing up for it, but yeah, a lot of emails. But like
Email is a scalable channel.
Thank you, Greg Sung. But it was not clear. The success of LinkedIn was absolutely not clear at that point. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about why, of all the companies you could have worked for, why you then went to LinkedIn at that period, and in terms of, and think about entrepreneurs or people watching this and saying, hey, do I start my own company? Do I go join a company? And which company should I be picking, and which horse should I be jumping on?
Yeah, well, it was very interesting because actually, not unlike Wealthfront, I didn't know Reid Hoffman ahead of time. It turned out we had some friends in common, but we had never met, which is usually pretty surprising to people. And a guy who's now a partner at Greylock introduced us, John Lilly, who was at the time.
He worked with you at Apple, didn't he?
Yeah, so John and I know each other from Stanford and worked together at Apple. And so I talked to John about companies that would be interesting to talk to. And John was the CEO of Mozilla, and of course Reid Hoffman was on the board of Mozilla. And he said, well, it's like, based on everything you've told me, you really should go talk to Reid about LinkedIn. And I had used LinkedIn. And, look, I'm a consumer guy, so I really love working on products that I believe in and on systems that I think solve a real problem. It turns out I've always believed, going back to college, that the secular trend is that we're all responsible for our own careers, right? That old advice that, who you are and, what you know and who you know are the most valuable things in your professional life. That the idea that anyone else was going to provide that to you, those days were over. And that the idea that technology could help people in this new world navigate their careers and own their reputations, I just thought was phenomenally powerful. So I met Reid actually at that dingy Hobies that's on Alma. And Reid pulls up in like a beater 92 Accord. And Reid wasn't at the time Reid Hoffman, Forbes 400. But I mean, he had, been one of the PayPal guys, right? Like, he was successful. He comes out of the car and he's in like shorts and Crocs and a beat up polo. And I think we sat at that Hobies for 4 hours.
It is an awful Hobies, isn't it?
It's the worst. I love Hobies, but that actually is the worst Hobies.
It's a scary one.
But we actually sat there for 4 hours talking about what product management and what product meant in a Web 2.0 world. So back in 2007, it was very fashionable to think that, hey, now that we can just push stuff out quickly to users, like engineers, you push out code, get feedback from the users, why do you need a product manager, right? And so we had a lot of debate about how much of that was true, how much the responsibility was changing, what great product was. And it was so funny because as he's walking back to his car 4 hours later, he goes, actually, we do need someone in product at LinkedIn. And I said, well, I have an offer from these other companies. You'd have to move pretty quickly. He's like, oh, we can move quickly. And I interviewed in their old building off of near Ming's when they were located there. And 2 days later, I had an offer, and I started at LinkedIn, and it was a fantastic experience. But it was really not obvious at the time. I think the company had about 70 people. It had users, to your point. They just crossed 10 million users, but it had taken them a long time to get there. And most people looked at LinkedIn and said, oh, I get it, online resumes. Why is that a business? Like that, how do they make any money? Everyone was always shocked to find out that LinkedIn made any money whatsoever, because the assumption was like basically you were putting up a homepage service.
So do you, as you look back on that, do you say, was it Reed that pushed you over the edge? You met with Reed and you said, wow, this guy could take it to the promised land? Or was it the people that you interviewed with, or was it just, hey, this seems like a good opportunity, and you couldn't have possibly guessed it would have become what it became?
I think there's a couple questions in there. I mean, one of the things is after business school, I had the chance to work in venture capital for a couple of years as an associate. And it's not necessarily a path that I recommend, but I did learn a few things in that role. And one of the things I learned was that any year, any given time, there's a relatively small group of companies that have 10 million or more in revenue. They're growing 100% year over year. They're usually 50 to 100 people. And that was this kind of sweet spot, right? The company's in hypergrowth, the business model's figured out, there's clearly product market fit. And if you're looking to learn, right, like those companies tend to be the ones that all the best people want to work for. And you're actually learning lessons that matter because the market's rewarding it. And so actually part of the reason, I hate to say I'm not some visionary, like LinkedIn met all of those criteria at the time, right? It may not have been sexy. It may have just looked like a resume service, but they had just crossed 10 million in revenue. They were growing 100% year over year. They had 50 to 100 people. I hate to say, like, what was that Mark Twain quote? Like, history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme a lot, right? Like, Silicon Valley has seen companies like this. I mean, we actually now at Wealthfront publish a list of these companies every year. And actually, to show you how amazing this time is, normally that list of companies is like half a dozen or a dozen. I think our list at Wealthfront this year was 136 companies that kind of meet all of those criteria. So I mean, in terms of LinkedIn, I think that's all good from kind of career navigation standpoint. Personally, though, like I said, I'm a consumer guy. The thing that I believed in with LinkedIn was not that it was going to be successful, but that it had the potential to be great. In the early days, when we would talk about things, frankly, in 2007, we all had a lot of confidence that LinkedIn was going to work. We would say that all the time. And Reed says it's like, we knew that LinkedIn would work. What we didn't know is whether LinkedIn could be big, whether it could be huge, whether it could be a platform company. And so every day we were getting up, we were not getting up fighting for like, hey, is this company going to be around in a year? We were saying, hey, we have a rare shot to make a company that matters. And we were excited to take that shot. So I can't take any of the credit for getting the company to that place. And all the early folks who kind of did the early iterations, lived through the dark days where, I mean, it took them like over 460 days to get their first 1 million users. I mean, it was hard slogging. But I was very excited because I'd come out of eBay. I was very excited to be at a startup again. And all of a sudden, when you hit that knee in the curve with product market fit, the magic that you get is that you get data. Right? When you're a startup before product market fit, you're getting information all the time, you're getting data. You just don't know which data is good. Maybe this is a group of users that isn't the target market. Maybe this is a group of users whose activity pattern won't scale to the next million. LinkedIn was at a phase where actually if you stopped working by gut intuition and started actually looking at the data of what people were doing with LinkedIn, you could learn an amazing amount about what the platform was capable of. And so, I mean, I know it's very obvious right now, but this idea of kind of data-driven product, data-driven hypothesis testing, et cetera, it was still relatively early days for that. And I think LinkedIn, Facebook, and a lot of the companies of the last generation figured that out in that time frame.
Our hashtag is Startup Grind. I'd love to shift focus here and start talking about the financial services industry and talking about Wealthfront, of which you're the CEO. Tell us a little bit about the history of the financial services industry. Like, how has it evolved over the last 40 or 50 years? Give us a high level, quick kind of run through of just where the market has moved and kind of where it is, to where it is today.
It's a long story.
I know it's a long story, but you're good at telling it.
I'm pretty sure finance is not the oldest profession, but I'm pretty sure way back when someone made money, and then his friend was like, "Hey, I can help you with that." Like I think that business has been around for a long time. Um, Look, I actually don't think of the financial sector or the business. It's not it's not an ordinary sector. Finance is part of the infrastructure of every economy, let alone a modern economy. So the history goes back forever. I actually think but I don't think that's unique. A lot of technology companies, a lot of startups, one of the mistakes I see people make when they go into the consumer space is they act like humans have changed so much in the last few decades, in the last few hundred years, last few thousand years. And the truth is human needs and what motivates us has not changed that much. Like we're largely the same creatures, at least I believe so. But what you see is that innovation, technology, culture always offers this new opportunity to reimagine solutions to those needs. And in the consumer space, some of the motivation is just people get bored and want something new. No one's ever happy with the way things are. They always think there could be something better. So there's an evergreen opportunity to reimagine things. The magic that's happening right now, and what I think is going on in the last 20 years, is that technology is moving at such an accelerated pace that there's now an actual new bonus in financial technology, a new motivation, which is now you can do things economically that just weren't possible before. And so like I look at Wealthfront, it's this classic example where it's not like people haven't been managing money for a very, very long time. And navigating this decision of who do you trust with your money goes back a long way. I think it's amazing that we have a new generation of consumers and investors out there that actually think that an automated service is the right way to go versus the traditional method. But let's not forget that part of the attraction of Wealthfront is that we can reach an audience hundreds of times, if not thousands of times bigger than the traditional industry. Because the traditional industry loses money managing accounts. I had one large bank executive tell me that accounts under $500,000 are loss leaders for them. I want you to think about that and how many people in the U.S. have $500,000. I mean, at Wealthfront, our minimum is $500. We're free under $10,000. And that's because, not just because of the goodness of our heart, but it's because in a software-based system, in an automated system, we can actually afford to do that. So I do think that what's going on right now is that the radical improvement in technology in the consumer space, the radical improvement in Wall Street in handling large pools of capital are converging to open up consumer solutions of really opening up a huge new audience to technologies and capabilities that frankly haven't been available to the average retail consumer because it wasn't economic to do it. So I think that's at least motivating what's going on in our subsector. I mean, there's different things going on in lending, there's different things going on in payments, there's different things going on in a lot of different subsectors. But when it comes to investing for better for worse, has been the playground of the wealthy for most of history. And that's the biggest change that's going on right now.
In terms of regulation and, as you talk about this history, this has been going on forever, and you've had regulation in this industry forever and ever. How does your startup navigate that, and B, how are things changing in that regard? Are things changing, or is it still you fighting with laws and rules that were set 20, 30, 50 years ago?
Yeah, well, I don't think that's unique to financial services, to be honest. One of my first funny regulatory meetings I remember at eBay was when I was doing my first feature at eBay. I get back this thing from the content manager that edited my product specification, which says like, no, they're not auctions. And I'm like, what do you mean? I'm pretty sure they are auctions. They're like, no. It turns out in the United States, there's 100-year-old laws in pretty much every state that ever had cattle about what you legally have to do to be an auctioneer. Right? Because if it's 1890, like you can't just let anyone auction off cattle. And so eBay had gone through this huge legal fight, and so they were auction-style listings. Auction-style, I like that. So I think that actually anytime you do anything that touches the economy in a meaningful way, you're going to run into regulations. I think a lot's made of that, and I think it's because there's some companies like Uber and Airbnb that have run into regulations and existing entrenched interests. The truth is, I think when you're in a regulated industry, there's always two choices. Historically, the traditional Silicon Valley approach has been hide from the government, hide from regulators as long as possible, grow as big as you can, and then by the time these political interests, which are usually assumed to be nefarious in some way and controlled by existing industry, come at you, you have an army. You have a huge population of consumers who are also voters who love your service, and they will help you navigate the political waters, right? But I think you're seeing a new crop of companies come up now that are taking a different approach. And these are companies that are proactive. They look to educate regulators and the government and policymakers and say, hey, actually these changes bode incredibly well for dealing with a lot of the problems that we have. And not, instead of being afraid that the traditional industry is going to co-opt the politicians, instead say, hey, if you're proactive in educating everyone, maybe that's a better path. And so, for better or for worse, LinkedIn took that path and has actually had a pretty good run of it in terms of its interaction with regulators, both in the US and Europe and other countries because of it. And I think I learned a lot from that experience compared to some other companies. And so Wealthfront, the truth is we're in the trust business. So actually, I don't want to ever fight with regulators. It's actually, I think when people go to Wealthfront and find out we're an SEC registered investment advisor and FINRA regulated, that builds trust, right? Like, we're not fighting the system. It turns out with money, you don't so much want to fight the system. You want to know that the system is protecting your money, taking care of you. I think it goes to trust. And so the truth is Wealthfront actually is very attractive to regulators right now because I think as one of them put it, we had the Secretary of Labor from the White House actually visit Wealthfront. But one of the excitement that Washington has about Wealthfront is in some ways we are taking the most boring of investment advice out there. I mean, think about it. We are telling young people, you know what you should do is spend less than you make, save money regularly, and put it into index funds that charge really low fees. Oh, and rebalance all the time and reinvest dividends. So boring. And the fact that we've turned this into this sexy platform, technology, Silicon Valley, that we're getting a huge number of young investors to kind of adopt this, they think it's like, I mean, I think the way one of them put it was like, it's like you guys made broccoli cool. So actually, from our point of view, we're not fighting anything. If anything, I would argue that a lot of regulators have been struggling with how to push the industry to roll out solutions like Wealthfront for the average investor, things that are low cost, things that don't have high fees, things that are actually not chasing returns or fake promises of protection. So we'll see. That's the approach we're taking. I think if you look around Silicon Valley, you'll see both approaches. They both can work. But I think you have to be careful about really understanding what type of business you're building and choose a regulatory strategy that matches your business and your customer need.
I think one of the really interesting things about what you've done or the customer base you have this kind of millennial customer base. Majority of your clients are under 25, under 35, and they represent this at the moment. Is it like $1 trillion or something in assets versus so it seems very small right now versus some of the baby boomer which is 10x that or something and so what's interesting to me is to see what you guys are doing and to see hey it appears to only today it appears to only represent this kind of smaller market. You do cater to the audience as well, but you're kind of focused or your core user is that person. And yet, these big established competitors are still, they're coming after you guys. They're talking about you. They're criticizing you. They're, in kind of the way that you see the same thing you see with Uber, the same thing you see with Airbnb. But do you think, do you guys see that as just that kind of that millennial pie just growing so significantly over time that time is in your favor if you just that you they can take what's there today and you'll kind of take this future asset group, or do you see yourself being a solution for everyone, or how do you look at what's the available market or the core market that you have today versus what you could have in 5 or 10 years?
I think it's a great question, and it is true. Like, so look, I'm an engineer by training, so I love technology, right? And so there's always a view of startups and new products and services that they're all technology driven, right? Something is possible now that wasn't possible 10 years ago, and it's going to change everything. There's this other theory that actually markets are ready for a solution. There's some customer base out there that wasn't having their needs met. And all of a sudden you meet that need, and the market sweeps you up. I'm actually a believer that both those things have to be true to really build a great long-term sustainable business. And actually in financial services, that is exactly what's going on. So if this sounds repetitive to some people in the audience, I apologize. Clay Christensen actually was one of my advisors in business school. So his theories have actually influenced me a lot. I like Clay's theories on disruption because they were the first management theories I ran into that assumed your large competitors were actually really smart and had resources and weren't just bumbling, stupid, slow, big companies. If you know anyone who works for large companies, or if you work for a large company, you've probably known the truth, and I've worked for large companies, that they're filled with brilliant people who have tons of resources and a lot of good data, and actually are attacking the market pretty aggressively. So what you talked about generationally is what's going on is that, look, this is the first time in my lifetime, like 40 years, where actually we have not one but two large generations moving through the economy. I mean, the story for the last 20 or 30 years has been the baby boomer story. When I was in high school, first doing policy stuff, it was what's going to happen when the baby boomers retire. Guess what? That's actually happening now. All the baby boomers are either 10 years before or 10 years after retirement, and they control $15 trillion. That's a big number. Schwab, Vanguard, Fidelity, Merrill Lynch, they all have $2 to $4 trillion each. And the banks also have trillions. Like, trillions used to be a big number. The US has 34 trillion in the US alone. As you pointed out, there are more millennials out there. And I know it sounds crazy, but I'm just going to say the millennials are not going to be the first generation that don't end up creating more economic value over the next 50 years than the previous generation before them. There's more of them. They have more technology. I'm very optimistic about that in the long term. The problem that the big firms always run into is that they're very, very good about knowing who their best customers are. And if you are in the money business today, your best customer is in their 50s or 60s, has a much larger account, likes visiting the branch, likes talking to people. And so you make a list of your best customers and what features they want, and you end up with Charles Schwab. I mean, they're really, really good at their business. And by the way, their average customer is in their 50s. Average advisor is also in their 50s, shockingly. Wealthfront is just hitting this fact that there's this other generation, 90 million Americans, many of which aren't even out of college yet. But they grew up with technology in a different way, and they grew up with markets in a different way, and they're at a different age. And most of our customers do not want to spend their time managing their money. They want to focus on their career. They want to focus on their friends. They want to focus on their family. They want to focus on their interests and hobbies, social impact. You can make a list of what 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds want to do and what they prioritize, and managing their money is really not top 5. And so they want to delegate it. The difference is, if you're over 50, you might have a bias of saying, oh, I need to trust someone with their money. It turns out more and more young people are saying, I want to trust a service, right? They trust technology with their money. Now, like I told you before, for the traditional industry, if an account under $500,000 is a loss leader for you, doing business with a lot of young people who might have accounts that are hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars feels like obviously a loss leader. I mean, there's a reason why the industry, banks, collected $38 billion in overdraft charges in 2011. That's their way of trying to make money off small accounts. Because we're a different platform, we don't have to make money that way. We can afford to make that bet. You know, for us, a $90,000 account, which is like our average of what a customer gets to in about 12 months, that pays us about $200 a year. Traditional financial services, they look at $200 a year and they go, that is a crazy small amount of money. Like, they can't even imagine that that would be interesting because their costs are so high. As a software company, you look at a $200 a year subscription, you go like, oh, I could build a great software company off $200 a year subscription. There's a lot of software companies that have to do with much less than that. And so I think it's just a different perspective, but you know, for us, that change in the market is the opportunity. Part of what Wealthfront counts on is, despite the bluster and the big guys talking and writing posts, and I'm happy that there's a URL on Schwab's site now that actually is like a response to Adam Nash.
It's pretty interesting. I mean, it's pretty amazing.
It's amazing. My wife was shocked when she's like, did you see that they wrote a response to you? And they quoted your Twitter profile? Do you know this?
But I mean, if you step back and you just looked at it from the outside, which That's kind of where I see myself in this whole. This is not. I worked in games. I mean, like, and I look at this from the outside. I'm just like, geez, like, how angry are they to what's going on over there that they're so concerned? I mean, if you just looked at the numbers, what are you? You're less than 1% of what they're doing, way less than 1%, and yet here they are, really seemingly. It looks like they're afraid of you. It's just it's a very strange dynamic.
Yeah, it's flattering. I think that a lot of folks in Silicon Valley, that was actually the shocking moment, was when Schwab responded. Like, we're used to David tilting at Goliath. We're not used to Goliath whipping out the slingshot and throwing something like David. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, he lops off heads with his.
Yeah, that's what's supposed to happen,
his
right?
sword.
The big guys. So, but actually, I give Schwab credit. I don't know Chuck Schwab personally, although some of our investors are very close with him. And by all accounts, he's a great guy and a great entrepreneur, and he's built an amazing company. I think the reason Charles Schwab reacted first is because actually, when you have a founder there who built a company 3,000 miles from Wall Street into one of the most successful financial services, right, headquartered in San Francisco. And by the way, he built his business, he started in the 70s. And in the early days, his customers were in their 20s and 30s. And they were doing this crazy thing called discount brokerage. And they have now grown up to be a giant because they grew up with the baby boom generation. And so I actually don't think this. One of our investors who talked to him, this is a true story. One of the reasons we talk about Charles Schwab all the time is because actually Chuck told one of our investors that Wealthfront reminded him a lot of the early days of Charles Schwab. And so it turns out, I think that the reason they reacted is because actually they know that when you have a founder around, when you don't take things for granted, when you're always hungry, you're not really worried about you compete with the big guys. But in Silicon Valley, you're always looking over your shoulder at the next generation of startups. You know that that's where the next disruption is going to happen. And I think we're in their backyard. And so actually, I think to their credit, they aggressively moved to launch a product. Unfortunately, that doesn't solve their dilemma, which is that every dollar they spend on the automated service, to your point, for a few $1 billion, is a dollar that they're not spending going after the $1 to $2 trillion business they have. They have $1.2 trillion in RA platforms alone. So the gravity of the business, just every quarter they have to announce to Wall Street, just pulls them back. I remember in Q1, they had to actually disclose that one of the variances in their earnings was the marketing spend they did launching their product. That's hard. So I think look, it's just like e-commerce. Everyone's going to do this. We are incredibly confident now that we were correct in our technology vision, that an automated service is a better way to do things. In the next 10 years, everyone's going to use some form of automated service. We want to be that paragon company, that one who drives innovation forward, just relentless at pushing at what technology can do, and be 100% focused, direct to consumer, on that millennial investor.
Tell us a little bit about the big pivot that Wealthfront made a couple years ago. People if you look at the company today, say, my gosh, they've raised $140 million. It's like everything. They've amazing office in downtown Palo Alto, which, by the way, you have like the coolest entryway I've ever seen in an office with like, how many thousands of pennies do you have? You have this like display with how many thousands of pennies are there?
It's about 300,000.
300,000 pennies.
It's actually a lot cheaper than other building materials in Palo Alto.
I am sure that is actually very true. And so, like, just tell us what happened and where that shift came from. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I'm happy to say it's not really my story to tell, although I think it's really interesting. What you're referring to is the fact that, so Wealthfront as a service just launched in December 2011. In fact, we just hit our 4-year anniversary yesterday. Right? That's how young the service is. And I actually was an early client. Before I joined the company 3 years ago, I had joined the service in January 2012. So early believer as a customer, et cetera. It's actually how I met Andy Ratcliffe. But before that, actually, Wealthfront was a company called Kaching. Cool name. Still have the domain. Maybe use it someday. But actually, I think that, Dan Carroll is a co-founder, Andy Ratcliffe, had this vision. They had this great idea for a product. In fact, I know it's a great idea because I feel like every year there's another startup trying to do it again. It's just one of those evergreen ideas. Kaching was a marketplace. Who doesn't love building a marketplace, right? And the idea was like, look, financial advisors have a problem. They can't attract new clients. And clients have a problem. They don't know how to pick a financial advisor. So what if you had a marketplace where advisors put up all their portfolios for what they were doing? Clients could come in, put some money with different folks, and then they could find people that they liked and put more money with them. So advisors get clients get their money managed. Ka-ching would collect something in the middle. I mean, it sounds like genius, right? It's like, this is going to be worth billions. It's a great idea, except for the part where it doesn't work. But otherwise, fantastic idea. And so they pushed on it for a couple years, and actually their numbers were not bad. I mean, I think they got to like 250,000 users. They got to something like $30 million managed, which is actually where a lot of historical fintech companies end up. Like they get friends and family and friends of friends on the service, and they get 20, 30 million in there, and then it just stalls out. And what they saw was the numbers were like this. They just weren't doing the hockey stick. They weren't going like this. And Andy Ratcliffe is famous. I mean, he's one of the co-founders of Benchmark Capital, incredibly successful investor. He knows what successful paths look like, and he was like, this is not going that way. And they dug in, and they found out that there was a problem that they hadn't foreseen, which is that it turns out there's two types of investor out there. There's do-it-yourselfers and delegators. Do-it-yourselfers, there's a certain number of people, it's a minority, but there's a small number of people, 10 to 20%, who just want to manage money themselves. They are going to trust no one to do it. And there's no fee you could ever charge that makes them happy, right? You charge $20, they want it for 10. You say 10, they want 5. You say 5, they want it free. You give it to them free, they want some extra bonus or prize for you. It's like there's no amount. Because
so true.
Yeah, they don't trust anyone to manage their money. They just want to do it themselves. The much larger audience, there's about 80%, are delegators. They don't have the time or inclination or confidence to manage their own money. They just want to trust someone to do it who's an expert. But they're just afraid of two things. They're either afraid of being defrauded or doing something stupid. Right? Those are the two motivations. So the problem was the marketplace, ka-ching, was good for neither. The do-it-yourselfers would put in a little bit of money because they wanted to see what the pros were doing. But they weren't going to put money in this system because they were going to go trade it themselves. Right? So they're not going to put money in. The delegators looked at this problem of like, how do I pick from dozens and dozens of advisors? They're like, if I wanted to pick from dozens and dozens of stuff, I just pick from dozens and dozens of investments. Like you took one problem and replaced it with another problem. And so Wealthfront came out of this fact that's saying like, well, wait, if most of the audience just wants a simple, trustworthy solution, very transparent, and they're mostly just afraid of being defrauded or doing something stupid, why don't we just take the most academically credible solution that exists today and implement it in software and be the advisor? And of course, you can imagine the engineers looking at this. So you can imagine Dan and Andy kind of having to give this talk saying, we're going to build this thing. And they're looking and saying, like, we built a system that can handle any number of advisors, an arbitrary number of portfolios, end-by-end complexity, trade on multiple custodians. And you want us to build a single advisor that does one? And they're like, can you do it? And they're like, yeah, that's super easy. It actually turned out to be harder than they thought. But actually, that was some of the leverage that Wealthfront has. And one of the reasons we've been able to scale is actually the back-end infrastructure and technology solution that we built was actually built to handle a lot more complexity. But I give them a lot of credit because most pivots don't work. And there's a lot of advertising about pivot. It took a lot of guts. Like when they made this pivot in the beginning of 2011, because it took them the better part of the year to build Wealthfront, they did not have a lot of money left. Like they had raised their Series A few years ago. Like that was not. When I joined the company, there was only really a few months of cash left, maybe 4 or 5 months. But the amazing thing is, and when they launched in December 2011, it didn't just work overnight. They kept tweaking it. They added a viral system in February of 2012. They ported to a new platform in the summer of 2012. And then, all of a sudden, they roll to this new platform, and there's a blip. August is bigger than July. Another blip. September is bigger than August. This is when I'm talking to Andy. October is even bigger than September. They had hit on something.
Do you think it was some of your advice that you gave him at that time that was changing?
I can't take credit for it at all. Andy told me it was amazing. It just shows you how all the pieces have to come together. Product market fit is very, very elusive. What actually happened was they finally gotten to the point where they eliminated most of the major friction in the flow. Right? That last change in the summer was that it used to be to open up a Wealthfront account, you had to mail in a check. I know, it sounds so stupid. They knew it was not a good, but they had, it turned out literally, they implemented over 5 different custodians. Everyone to open a brokerage account at that time required you to mail in a check. After that, you could link a bank account and push money over and that sort of thing. But the first, anyone who's who's older than 30 in the audience will remember, that actually was a thing. Like, to open an account, you had to like mail in a check. I remember opening my first investment account, you had to actually come in with a checkbook and write a check. And so they finally found a custodian who didn't require a check. And they barely squeaked in to get it built in 2012. The minute that friction went away, all of a sudden the 12 other great things they had done in the product started to take over. And that viral system they had built started to work. And people started referring the product. And they started seeing this month-over-month growth because the product was a great product. I mean, it's much better now, but it was a great product. It was just a little bit too much friction for a viral system to work. A little bit too much friction to get enough people in the door to recommend it. And so that last piece turned out to be a little bit like the arch, the keystone in the arch, where all of a sudden the numbers started working. And then, my favorite part of the business, they started getting real data about what clients were doing and what they wanted. And they just started rolling it out. And it was very innovative. It was October of 2012, Wealthfront rolled out tax loss harvesting, which is a very fancy way of saying that instead of having one ETF for each asset class, there's multiple, there's 2. And that if something goes down, you can sell one, so you take your losses quickly, but if it goes up, you hold your gains for the long term. Because it turns out the IRS only cares about what you did this year. Like, our entire tax system says that you should take losses quickly, because the rate on short term is high, and you should hold gains for the long term. Like, we built our tax system to support that. And rich people, going back to the 80s, take advantage of that to make sure that they take losses quickly and hold gains for the long term. Wealthfront said, what if we automate this in software? So they rolled that out in October 2012. Now that's a standard for the industry. Now, like Schwab, when they roll out their service, they have to say they have tax loss harvesting. Our competitors all copied it in 2014 and 2015. But at the time, it was very innovative. And for the first time, people looked at Wealthfront and said, wow, that's something I can't do myself. Maybe there's something to this automated service.
Did you guys patent that or anything?
It turns out the IRS doesn't let you patent tax stuff.
Oh, okay.
They have a special exemption built in. They're like, we will not let you patent anything that decreases revenue to the government. So they have a.
I think
I actually learned this. They have a special exemption in the
That's
patent law. They're like, yeah, you can't do that. So.
I mean, the truly interesting thing about this whole story about Wealthfront, at least in my mind, is that here was this group of smartest engineers in the world, Google alums, Stanford alums, one of the best venture capitalists of all time, kind of building this thing. You think it's going to be perfect, and then they literally have enough money for one more shot, and that's not you feel. I feel like we hear that a lot, like in this kind of creation myths. We hear companies tell this story, and with this company, it was absolutely true that they were going to put all the money into this kind of this insight that they had, and that was finally, it was all the work they had done to learn, and the culmination, and then fueling this engine of this foundation that you guys had built. And as I have watched Wealthfront, it's felt like it could really happen to anyone, in terms of people working really hard, smart people dedicating their lives, disrupting an industry, and then just not giving up. And now, a couple years later, it's like, geez, this thing is, you've got a page dedicated to you on Charles Schwab's website. But 3 years ago, you would have never, it would have been, that may have been laughable, or 4 years ago.
Well, it gets back to what I said. What I like about Andy and Dan, about the whole company and the culture that we're building is, I think that everyone at Wealthfront is in it because they believe that the industry won't change by itself. That there's no amount of regulation or populist movement, that the way you're going to change things is by actually building innovative products and services that are successful in the market, and that will force the industry to change. So actually the Schwab moment for us, it was our first little dent in the universe. Like, no one doubts that if Wealthfront wasn't around, that Schwab would be rolling out this service with lower costs and higher value for their customers. Like, there's a $2.5 trillion giant, we made them do that, right? Fidelity will roll out theirs, the banks are all talking about it. that's the impact I think you want to have. I mean, look, we manage almost $3 billion. What I give credit to Andy and Dan for is that, there's always a trap because you think you want to be risk-seeking, but it's so easy to choose the safer path, right? Is there some way we can squeak out a business here? Is there, like LinkedIn, is there some way we could make this sustainable this size, right? Managing almost $3 billion, it's not hard to build a sustainable business where you're managing almost $3 billion. But that's not why anyone's at Wealthfront. That's not what we're in for. I think what Andy did and Dan with Kaching and the whole team, right, our CTO was from those days and other folks, is they realized that Kaching was not on a path to really be that type of company that made a difference, right, to actually influence the market. And so they were willing to take that risk because actually the not doing anything meant a guarantee that they weren't going to have a shot at building something that mattered to them. I think that's what gives you the courage to take that risk, is because actually the opposite is also a risk, right? If you don't take the shot at building something great, at Wealthfront today, we have a lot of people, I think, who are not in it because they want to take the safe path. We've been given amazing resources. I mean, you mentioned we raised a lot of money. We have amazing talent. Everyone from our newest engineers all the way up to the executive team and our investors. And I tell the whole company, we have an opportunity to build a great company. But it's not a guarantee. But most companies never even get that shot. And so I'm at least far enough in my career to know that it's a rare opportunity and it's worth giving it your all to try and make it happen.